I'm Michael Cohen. I'm a senior fellow at the American Security Project and a blogger at democracyarsenal.org and writer in various fine publications across Washington.
And my name is Daniel Serwer. I'm a professorial lecturer at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. How are you feeling about the President's announcement this week on Afghanistan?
Well, it's unusual for me because I've been sort of writing about Afghanistan for off and on about 2 years now, and I've really never been optimistic. And today, after the President's speech was the first time I would say in 2 years that I felt somewhat optimistic. Because part of it, I think, is because, and I wrote about this in a piece in the Atlantic that was out on Thursday. Part of the reason is that I think for the first time the President has taken control of his Afghanistan policy. I think that, initially, at least when he escalated the war in December of 2009, he did so in some measure, I think, under a little bit of coercion from both the military and from his own campaign promises to sort of win the good war in Afghanistan. And I don't think his heart was truly in the surge. I'm not sure he was convinced it was going to work. What I see now is a president who's willing to stand up to his generals and willing to do what he thinks, I think articulate the best policy going forward. I think you could argue whether it's the best approach, and I think there's some problems with the president, so we can get more into that. But I think insofar as the president sort of getting control of the policy and establishing control of the policy, I think it's a very positive development.
I think you're right. That's what he's done. I'm worried, though, about what he's done. I think he has tried to reconfigure the goals a bit to correspond more with his willingness to fight, and that's a good thing. But still, I worry that we're going to end up leaving an Afghanistan that frankly can't defend itself, can't govern itself, and will become a haven for extremists who are fighting in Pakistan. And Pakistan, to me, is the real object of concern here.
Yeah, I actually would agree. I agree to an extent that there's not a lot of. It doesn't appear the administration is spending a lot of time thinking about what happens after they leave. I think you could define the policy as as let's get out, let's declare victory and go home. And I think where the problems that I think we may actually have agreement here is that there's not a really clear sense. There never has been a clear sense from the administration as to what does an endgame look like? What not just for the U.S. but for Afghanistan.
But that's exactly right, and it's very troubling. You have to have an end state in mind, or else you risk doing things that don't make any sense. I don't really know how you can expect either the military to fight a war or the civilians to engage in the more political side of the effort without a clear end state in mind. And the President has refused repeatedly to specify a political end state. The closest he got was in this speech to saying, we're going to go ahead with reconciliation. But the fact is that reconciliation is extremely problematic because it's hard to picture a reconciliation solution that all of Afghanistan can feel even remotely comfortable with. The Northern Alliance women are going to object to reintegrating the Taliban. And it's just very troubling to see us unwilling to focus so much on the number of troops that we're unwilling to specify what we're actually trying to accomplish.
Yeah, I think the focus on troop levels has been a distraction for the last couple of weeks, and I sort of am a little frustrated by it because, to your point, there needs to be a clear political strategy. We need a clear sense of what actually, as you said, how do you get to the process of reconciliation? And I think I'm probably more optimistic in reconciliation than you are. I think that for what I can tell, there seems to be interest on both sides to achieving it. I think, actually, to be honest with you, the one institution that seems most opposed to reconciliation is actually the military. And the biggest problem that I've seen so far is that you have folks on the civilian side who say, okay, we need to figure out a way to talk to the Taliban. We have these talks going on in Germany. They're very embryonic. We don't know how they're going to develop. But there's not been a real effort to marry, that initiative, that effort to talk to Taliban with what's happening on the ground. And that's where I think the real problem lies.
Where do you see the Taliban interest in reconciliation really demonstrated?
Well, I think the fact that they're participating in talks, suggests to me that there is interest there. If you look at the Century Foundation report that came out, was it, guess, March or something, or April. This was, Lakhdar Brahimi and Thomas Pickering that talked to a lot of these folks. I mean, at least folks connected with the Taliban and Quetta Shura. There seemed to be at least some interest, embryonic interest, in talking. I think, for what it's worth, I mean, there are factions in the Taliban who do want to talk and those who want to keep fighting. But I think you have to explore the option. I mean, I think part of what I've noticed about the resistance to reconciliation is people saying, well, it can't work. Well, we're not going to find out if we don't try.
No, that's exactly right. Of course we should try. We should always be trying for negotiated solutions where we can, because where we think they might produce something vaguely acceptable, obviously a lot less expensive and a lot less difficult than continuing to fight a war. But I've always I've been puzzled by where the signs of Taliban willingness are. And the notable thing about the Pickering Brahimi report was it was markedly lacking in detail, and we know that the U.S. government has been tricked in the past about who's really Taliban, who isn't.
Yes.
I remember when Mujahidi, the head of the Afghan Senate, was running the reconciliation program. We were all complaining bitterly that he was bringing in only small fry who may or may not have been real Taliban, and it was costing a lot of money. Well, there are exactly the same complaints emerging now about the newer reconciliation program. So I don't think we have a good strategy on the political side. I haven't seen it yet in any case, and I worry that we're so focused about the troop levels that we really don't know what we're doing on the civilian side. It's unclear to me from what the president said whether the civilian surge is over or whether it's supposed to continue. Or
it's over. Did it ever start? I'm not aware.
Well, I mean, it did start in the sense that they got more personnel out there. They've got quite a few personnel distributed at the district level in Afghanistan. Now, do those people stay at the district level? Are they withdrawn to more consulate-like structures? Do we try to use the NGOs and contractors more effectively as our capillary presence in Afghanistan? I mean, for the president to say, I don't really know how Afghanistan is going to be governed, it'll be imperfect, it gives me very little guidance if I'm a civilian in Afghanistan.
No, I agree that the president has been almost, I don't know the right word for it, but I don't say catastrophically, but certainly dangerously parsimonious in how he's talked about this issue, and to the point where it's incredibly frustrating because there is no guidance, and what's happened instead is the military has basically taken the lead. And the military, in my view, should not be the lead agency when it comes to determining what the political end state is in Afghanistan. And I think there's an argument to be made they don't really buy into the notion of reconciliation. That their view is they need to pound the Taliban into submission until they eventually want to come to the table. I think it's a terrible strategy. It's one that's going to actually backfire and further inflame the movement and probably harden Pakistan in particular's interest in actually seeing a deal get made. So I think, look, to me there's two ways to look at this. I think that on the one hand, the U.S. needs to be approaching this reconciliation as though it's a possibility and looking for ways to make that work. And I think that's got to be the first thing. And the second thing is, then once you proceed on that front, the second point is how do you prepare if this doesn't work? Okay. The one thing that he talked about in the speech, which I find surprising, was the strategic partnership agreement, the long-term U.S. military presence in Afghanistan. To me, that has to be a hedge against reconciliation not succeeding. So I was surprised he didn't mention it. I'm sort of disappointed he didn't mention it. And if anything, saying something to the Taliban is, you can wait these guys out because by 2014 they're all going to be gone. And I think that actually may have been the wrong signal for reconciliation to proceed in the near term.
Well, that certainly presents problems for the negotiators. I think there are some other things we need to consider that are really never discussed, never mentioned. And the thing that always comes to my mind first is the question of the Durand line. I mean, I don't know two countries that have a decent relationship when they haven't demarcated the border between them. And not only has Pakistan and Afghanistan not demarcated the border, they haven't even agreed the border, though Afghans will tell you we don't really dispute the border posts are there, but they refuse to agree to establish that as the border and to demarcate it. And the reason, I remember years ago I was in Kabul and I asked a national security advisor, why won't you accept the Duran line? That would be a stabilizing move. And he looked at me and he said, I wouldn't want to foreclose options for future generations. Well, I mean, that's incredible. I mean, how do we expect to be able to leave Afghanistan and Pakistan with no U.S. troops, and they haven't agreed their border, and somebody on the Afghan side, somebody important on the Afghan side, is thinking that to agree the border would be to foreclose options for future generations. Now, today, Pashtunistan doesn't represent an enormous threat to anybody, but Pakistanis who already face what they regard as an existential threat from India, don't need anybody reserving their options for future generations on the Afghan side of the border.
Right.
This, to me, is very much a part of what should be on our minds as we try to withdraw. I realize that for the president to mention the Duran line in a speech would be ridiculous. Nobody knows what it is. But this is the heart of the matter in relations between Pakistan and Afghanistan, and we can't leave Afghanistan unless we've worked out some sort of settlement of the border.
But see, this is interesting because I think we can leave, and I think we are going to leave. And actually, this to me points to the biggest failure of this policy, Afghanistan policy to date, which is that in December of 2009, the president agreed to surge on this military strategy that was unlikely to succeed and didn't succeed. I mean, we're basically at a stalemate now. It didn't succeed, I would argue, not because the military failed per se, but more because the strategic inputs into the strategy, Pakistan cooperation, Karzai government cooperation, that's the ANSF being built up, didn't happen. So, in a sense, I would argue that we wasted 18 months. And in the sense that we've wasted 18 months toward political reconciliation. There was no reason not to begin the process of reconciliation in December of 2009. And so what's happened now is that the political forces in the U.S. are driving us toward the exits. And that is, to me, you're absolutely right. I agree about the border issue need to be resolved, but we're not going to stay long enough to resolve that issue. I mean, I think by 2014, you will have, if any presence in Afghanistan of U.S. troops, it will be a minimal presence. It will not be a commitment.
But how are you going to, that may well be what happens. I can't say no. But the question in my mind would be, how are you going to prevent extremists from taking haven in Afghanistan and attacking Pakistan, which is a much bigger problem than extremists in Pakistan attacking Afghanistan, because Pakistan has nuclear weapons.
As long as you have as long as you have a U.S. military presence in Afghanistan, I think you'll end up fighting that war via drones and via special operations and, high-value targeting. You
really can't do that without a presence on the ground. I mean, you talk to the experts, and they'll all tell you that you just don't have the intelligence to be able to do it.
But we're doing it in Pakistan right now. I mean, we
have because we have the presence in Afghanistan, and even what we've done in Pakistan, even the killing of Osama bin Laden, obviously involved a presence on the ground in Abbottabad.
Sure, but it didn't involve cooperation with the Pakistani government, that's for sure. I mean, we know that.
No, it did not have the cooperation of the Pakistani government, but it did require a physical presence on the ground to collect the necessary intelligence. And that's
right, but
that's the problem with this robot warfare, that people are seeing only the drone aspect of it. They're not seeing the very real need for human and for presence on the ground.
Yeah, but I'm of the view that that's sort of overrated. I mean, I really do think that the importance of presence, having a giant force, first of all, having a giant force on the ground in southern eastern Afghanistan inflames insurgency, in my view. And I also don't understand the logic of if you're an extreme jihadist terrorist, why you would want to be in Afghanistan, even if there's nominal Taliban control in the south and the east, and even if there's just drones from the U.S., you're at huge risk of being killed. You're better off being in Pakistan, you're better off being in Yemen, you're better off being anywhere but Afghanistan. So to my mind, the threat does not, and also, finally, the threat doesn't justify the presence. I mean, there are other ways to secure America from extremist, jihadist terror groups than having a giant presence in Afghanistan.
No, well, I agree with that. I don't think the jihadist groups per se are the problem. But if ever if ever Pakistan's nuclear weapons fall into jihadist hands, we've got a big problem.
I agree, no doubt. But that's not. I guess to my mind, that the possibility of that happening is increased by our presence. That our presence destabilizes the region. That it continues Pakistan's alliance with extremist groups.
Well, it might have done that, but I'm not convinced that withdrawing us is going to reverse that situation. Things don't work that way. And, the notion that we've inflamed the resistance with our presence in Afghanistan may be true, but that doesn't mean that when we remove it that everything's going to go back to the status quo ante. And that would require a tremendous leap of faith, it seems to me.
No, I agree with that. I mean, you're right. That's not, but that isn't a reason not to do it. I mean, I guess the thing is that if the issue is what's the best way to protect U.S. interests and the best way to prevent against destabilization in the region, I'm not convinced that having a huge presence in trying to do pacification and stabilization in Pashtun-dominated areas is a smart way.
Well, I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced of that either. But I am convinced that as we withdraw, we have to have enough time and enough effort to keep the situation stable, to get Afghanistan to the point where safe haven there is not going to be easy for extremists from Pakistan, and where there's no real threat to the Kabul government. I mean, I think those who think there has been no real threat to the Kabul government, I think, are kidding themselves. There have been real threats to the Kabul government over the last couple of years, and I think the argument here is more about pace than anything else. I don't think there's anybody actually out there who thinks that we shouldn't begin drawing down at all. I mean, I think the issue is.
I think there are people who believe that.
Well, I suppose John McCain believes that.
I think in the U.S. military they believe that.
I don't know. I think they were prepared to see a slower drawdown. I think they've accepted this drawdown. Nobody's resigning over it. I mean,
true, but they're not happy about it. Clearly.
Yeah, they're not happy about it. But after all, they get to choose who gets drawn down, and they're going to choose people who are not trigger pullers, who aren't in the front line of the military effort. That may mean faster drawdown of some of the district reconstruction teams and things of that sort. And
right, but I think one thing sorry, go ahead. But I want to get to that point in a second. But go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Okay, so one thing I'll say about that though is that the military wants to go into the east. They think they've cleared the south, they passed by the south, they need to go to the east. And what you're hearing from the White House is no, we're not going into the east. And I think this actually is going to be a bit of a tussle, a bit of a real challenge to see how this plays out. My guess is that General Allen is going to do what the White House wants him to do. And I think if Petraeus was in charge, it'd be more of a challenge. And I think that that to me is going to be a huge step forward, at least in drawing down, because they're not going to be going to areas that have not been secured or not seen a heavy U.S. presence to date. And I think that's going to be represent a big shift in the policy, actually. And I think it also speaks to, by the way, how disastrous it was for the military to waste resources and time going into Marja in February of 2010. And I think that's another whole other question. But I think that just speaks to how bad the strategy has been implemented up to this date.
Well, I'm not going to defend the move into Marja, but I think you underestimate the influence of Petraeus from the CIA chair.
It's an interesting question.
He David, I know him for years now, and he's just a terribly bright guy with very clear ideas, and the position of CIA director is a very powerful position because it controls a lot of the information that goes to the president. I mean, I can tell you when I was in the State Department writing for the Secretary's Morning Summary, which existed then, doesn't exist now, I could set the agenda of the State Department with a good piece in the Secretary's Morning Summary. I was on the policy side at all. Supposedly, I was just the grunt who wrote the intelligence briefs. Well,
Right.
Let me tell you, that can have tremendous influence, the way you put things in an intelligence brief. So I would expect David to still have enormous influence on what goes on. I haven't reached any very firm conclusions about this question of the East, but it seems to me you gotta worry about what's left when we're gone, and whether and that means worrying about governance. Not that it should be controlled from Kabul, but what kind of governances are going to be in the South and the East. And it means worrying about whether the Afghan government can live with whatever reconciliation emerges from these talks. I mean, the fact of the matter is that the Northern Alliance is pretty dug in against any meaningful reconciliation. And, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to picture a situation in which the Taliban are given free rein over big pieces of Helmand, for example, and other provinces in the south, and they are de facto partitioned from the rest of Afghanistan. The Northern Alliance decides, well, we're going to govern ourselves up here. We're not interested in the way they govern down there, and the southern provinces start saying, well, we're Pashtuns on both sides of this Durand line. Why the hell don't we just make our own country?
Well, see, but I think what you're laying out is the endgame. And I'm not so sure it's the worst endgame in the world. I mean, a decentralized Afghanistan, where you have a weak central government and relatively strong sort of regional governance, is, there's a tradition of that, obviously, in Afghanistan.
Oh, I don't mind decentralization. I do mind redrawing of borders, because nobody ever agrees where they ought to be.
Right, but first of all, I don't think you'd see any actual partition. I mean, the one thing I was struck by when I was there, like in the fall, was whenever you talk to people, mention the idea of partition. I mean, there's the outrage that grows in that idea. I mean, even if people talk about what you mentioned, sort of de facto partition, I think actual partition would never happen. I also don't think Pakistan would ever want to agree to a situation in which you had, Pashtuns in the border regions merging with Pashtuns in Afghanistan. I think, if anything, they would like to have Taliban have a stakehold in the south, and they can exploit for their own, economic and political benefit. And I think that's the most likely scenario. I think what you're going to see is what you described, but I actually think it's probably a good thing in the long run. Probably better. I mean, I think we would agree that the current Afghan governance structure is kind of a disaster.
Yeah,
it's too centralized and it doesn't work properly. And it was a mistake from day one, and better to decentralize it. And it'd be great if that happened, not under the threat of force, but I think that's what's going to end up driving it.
Well, I can picture satisfactory outcomes. I don't disagree with you about that. I think decentralization is often part of the solution in these situations. So I can picture satisfactory outcomes. But what I don't see yet is the kind of concerted political effort to make sure it comes out right. Now, some of that may be hidden in the political reconciliation process. I mean, they don't have to tell me about it just because I want to know.
Right.
But
sure.
But there's something about the refusal of the president to broach this subject. He shrugs his shoulders and says, "Well, governance in Afghanistan won't be perfect." I know it's not going to be perfect, but what's it going to be like? I mean, the last I heard, they collapsed the bank that pays all the government employees, because the bank was basically a pyramid scheme. How often can you have that happen, and how many billions have been lost? I mean, you can claim those billions aren't ours, but I don't know where the hell else they came from.
I think
there's an inattention to the outcome, to the end state, on the political side that I find troubling.
Yeah, and in fact, I don't really understand it. I mean, even if you go back, and we could do chapter and verse criticism of Bush administration policy in Iraq, but at least in 2007, when they announced the surge, there was a clear political strategy. Okay, it was, we're going to create a political space. It didn't happen, but it created a political space via increased security for Sunnis and Shias to come together in reconciliation. I mean, it was a strategy. There was a logic to it. There's been none of that. And if you go back and look at the West Point speech, I mean, this is what I find most sort of shocking about this. There's nothing in there that lays out a political endgame to this.
That's exactly right. I can't disagree with that at all. But, I mean, how you can be happy with a drawdown in the absence of a political strategy, I'm not entirely clear. Well, I mean, I understand that you're against continuing the war, but there's a right way and a wrong way to end things, and the right way is to have a clear idea of what you're trying to achieve in the end.
Let me say this: there's a right way, there's a wrong way, but we don't. Unfortunately, I wish that we don't ever deal in right ways. We deal with wrong ways and maybe not such bad ways. And so I see this. The way I look at this is not as like a perfect solution. I mean, if you read my piece in the Atlantic, I'll mention it again. I do sort of criticize them for not laying a political strategy. I think, it's a fair criticism, and I absolutely buy it. But to get to the point where you can lay out a political strategy, you need to rein in the military. And this is kind of what I come down to a little bit, is that the military strategy has been, let's pound the Taliban, let's kill mid-level commanders, let's put a lot of pressure on them, and eventually they will come to the table and negotiate. I think that's a flawed strategy. It didn't work in Vietnam. I don't think it's going to work here for a variety of reasons. I think mainly because of Pakistan and the safe havens there. I think if you begin to rein in the military strategy, or rein in the military, then it creates more space to move forward on a political reconciliation. Now, that then means that the administration needs to lay out what that reconciliation strategy looks like. And I think what has to happen, and this is where I agree with you completely, what has to happen in the next month or 2 or 3 months or whatever is for the administration, and hopefully either Secretary Clinton or Ambassador Grossman can do this, to lay out, here's what we're willing to do, here's what an endgame looks like, here's what we're willing to negotiate. Or at least, I would argue, even more important, appoint a third-party facilitator to begin the process of feeling out both sides on negotiation. But the way they've done it to date, with having these secret talks that Karzai is not even involved in Germany, is not the way to proceed. They need to get, and Obama said this, they need to have an Afghan-led process. They need to get that process started, and need to lay out, as you said, what the end game looks like. This, what I see this speech as, is the first step in that process. But if they don't fall in the second step, then I will share your pessimism about what happens.
I don't know about this Afghan-led process stuff. These guys can't even, I mean, they can't find their rear ends with both hands. I mean, it's a government. It's a government that is profoundly dysfunctional in our terms. Now, it may be one of the things that I find puzzling about Karzai is that his way of governing is what we call corruption, but for him it's a system of governance. And so he may have a much clearer idea, and he certainly talked a lot about reconciliation, and I'm a little surprised if things are really going on without the Afghan lead. But I don't have an enormous amount of confidence in the notion that Karzai can bring along all of the political forces in Afghanistan that he needs to bring along. It's very troubling. I mean, can he really bring women into the tent? Can he bring Abdullah into the tent? I just don't know. I mean, it doesn't.
That's the challenge.
It doesn't much look like it.
In some ways, you could argue that getting the Tajiks on board, getting the northern groups on board might be the hardest part of the
It might be. That's not it's not uncommon that getting your own side together is at least half the battle. We always complain about what the Taliban look like to us. They look very fragmented. We don't know whom to talk to. Can you imagine what we look like to them? The Americans, the military, the civilians, the CIA,
right, exactly.
There's the coalition, the Afghans, there's the Northern Alliance. They must be tearing their hair out trying to figure out who speaks for whom.
But it's not surprising that they want to talk to the Americans. I mean,
no, it's not surprising. Power grows from the barrel of a gun in this situation. We got a hell of a lot more guns than anybody else.
But this is to your first point about how do you do this without Karzai? How do you not do this without Karzai? I mean, as bad as he is, and this is like I'm sort of the view on Karzai that this is kind of like the let Manny be Manny, when he's playing for the Red Sox. Like, let Karzai be Karzai. I mean, he's terrible and he's corrupt and he's
I kind of agree with that.
You're stuck with him. Yeah, what other option do you have? You hope that you can move him out in 2014 when there's another election, but until then you have to deal with him. You have no choice.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. It's just going to be awfully hard to work this. But, it may be that traditional Afghan ways have something to be said for them. I mean,
possibly, yeah.
He may be able to bring along people that you and I think might be irreconcilable. What I'm pretty sure he won't do is do well by women in Afghanistan.
No, I think that's probably true. Although I would say, that the issue, here's the thing. I mean, I wonder if you come up with a situation in which you are, I think if they try to do power sharing in Kabul and give Taliban a share of sort of governance, my guess is that would be a real deal breaker for the, for some of the northern groups. And I wonder if you come to some kind of reconciliation that involves, as we said before, it's decentralization and gives the Taliban sort of nominal control.
I think it's interesting.
That may be where you end up.
It's interesting because I'm really quite worried about decentralization that amounts to turning over large portions of the country to the.
But what other option do you have?
To the Taliban.
I don't see what other option you have.
Well, the other option is power sharing in Kabul. I mean,
but I think that's even a worse option.
Well, it may be a worse option in the sense that it's very difficult to manage, but I don't know. The turning over of a large portion of the country to the Taliban to me, is quite worrisome, because I think it bodes ill for the continued unity of the country and leads in directions that might be unstable. And instability is what we need to fear in this part of the world.
Right, but I think.
I'd be much more comfortable if that Duran line were recognized.
Well, can we broaden this a little bit then to talk about Pakistan? Because I think, I agree with you. Pakistan is the really important issue here. And the solution that we're sort of talking about, this sort of decentralized governance, is one that I imagine a somewhat neutered Karzai or neutered central government in Kabul with diminished, hopefully, Indian influence is something that I imagine the Pakistanis could live with and probably would be happy with. I don't get the sense that they want a Taliban takeover of the country again. I think that would be not in their interest to do, to see happen. And so I think from that perspective, some sort of a power sharing deal that gives the Taliban nominal control but doesn't give them, doesn't basically put them in Kabul, probably works for the Pakistanis. Works better than the current situation. Works better, I think, than the alternative of having the Taliban run the country again, which would create all kinds of problems for them, all kinds of problems, in Pakistan for them. And I wonder then if that's, part of what we sort of forget that with the Taliban. I mean, they have power, they have influence, but it's inversely proportional to how much influence and how much support they have from Pakistan. And that's one area that we haven't exploited effectively. We've tried to get the Pakistanis to turn against their nominal allies in Afghanistan, which is never going to happen. And instead of trying to work with them in a way that furthers their interests. And to me, that's the other part of the equation too. How do we work out a deal that keeps the Pakistanis happy and keeps them, from trying to destabilize.
Well, I don't disagree with working out a deal with the Pakistanis, that's for sure. But there too is extraordinarily difficult. I mean, who are the Pakistanis? I mean, you've got a government and a military,
sure.
And it's not a failed state yet, but it could well be on the way in that direction. And that's a really frightening prospect. It's a very large place, and it's got nuclear weapons. And, I think we really do need to refocus more attention on Pakistan. And by attention, I don't mean money. I think it's quite clear by now that there's far too much money in Afghanistan.
Yes.
Everybody I talk to has been there. You just got to stop the money flowing. And I talked to somebody today in the government who said to me, it's the one thing we can never do. We can't stop the money because somebody's always got a better use for it.
Right, of course.
And, he sounded quite frustrated, actually. And in Pakistan, also I don't think it's a money question. I think it's a question of political settlement with the Pakistanis. And it's an extremely difficult thing to imagine because of the splits in between the army and the civilians, the regional divisions in Pakistan. It just becomes an extremely complicated equation to solve.
But here's the thing. I mean, I agree and disagree. I mean, there are basic Pakistani interests in Afghanistan that are somewhat universal. Okay, minimizing Indian influence in the country is somewhat universal. Having, some sort of spheres of influence for Pakistan in Afghanistan is an area of interest. Stopping Afghanistan's support for, rebels in Balochistan, that is a universal area of agreement, I think, in Pakistan. And the problem that I have, and I related this recently, I wrote something about this to Gates' speech he gave recently on NATO, in which he criticized the Europeans for not spending enough money on defense. And it's sort of, it's like, at what point do we get the hint that the Europeans are never going to spend more money on defense and we should adapt our policy accordingly? Instead, we just kind of browbeat them. We do the same thing in Pakistan. Instead of recognizing Pakistan's interest in Afghanistan, instead of recognizing that they have certain, red lines of their own, we keep thinking if we give them more money and we put more pressure on them, eventually they'll come around and they'll turn against the Taliban. It's never going to happen. And what should happen instead is that our policy there should reflect, in large measure, Pakistani interests. They should be in concert. Instead, they're in opposition to each other. And in fact, the military strategy is directly in opposition to what the Pakistanis want. And so, to be honest, I would imagine that this speech from Obama was actually received quite well by the Pakistanis. That they see this as, yes, the Americans are going home, which is good, and B, it will, strengthen our hand in Afghanistan. And that's actually a step forward. But, the way to repair this relationship with Pakistan, and I agree with you, it's the most important relationship for the U.S. in the region, is to start recognizing Pakistan has interests, and we have to respect those interests. But we haven't done that to date.
Yeah, it's not going to be easy. I mean, frankly, Pakistan has its interests, but India is more important to us.
Sure.
And we have equities in Afghanistan as well. It's not going to be, the Afghans will not accept. If they won't even accept the Durand line, how are they going to accept the kind of deep penetration of Pakistani interests into Afghanistan that you're describing?
But do they have a choice? I mean, that's the other thing, too. At what point do the Afghans realize they have no choice in the matter?
Well, I mean, they can do to the Pakistanis what the Pakistanis have done to them and allow extremists to have safe haven in Afghanistan.
They are.
That's what I'm afraid holds
right
in the future as we withdraw. And that poses real threats to a nuclear weapon state that, they say they can protect their weapons, but then when they're asked to turn over the highly enriched uranium from a research reactor, they say, no,
right.
That's safe. Every other country in the world is turning that stuff over to the United States
right.
because they don't want it lying around. And Pakistan says that it's perfectly safe to have lying around at our universities? Come on, give me a break.
But that's my point, though. I mean, if you want to get to those issues, okay, which are much more important, then resolve this Afghanistan thing. I mean, that's part of what I'm getting at a little bit here. It's like we have wasted so much resources and time and effort on a war that is totally tangential to our national interests and has been for many, many years. The real issue is in Pakistan, and so our policy should reflect that fact. It shouldn't just be focused on Afghanistan. And unfortunately, our relationship with Pakistan is far too often reflected by what we're doing in Afghanistan, and that has to change. And that's really what partly.
Well, that will change. That will change with withdrawal. I mean,
right, exactly.
It will change, and in that sense, I mean, things are going in the direction you would prefer. I just worry profoundly about what things are going to really look like in 2014, and whether our interests will really be in better shape in 2014 if we haven't really focused hard on the political settlement and got something that's half decent that we can somehow sell to the Afghans and to the Pakistanis. I mean, but I don't see that. I mean, this obsession with troop numbers and are we going up, are we going down, just doesn't help me to see where the end state is.
No, and look, as I said before, I mean, I think the criticism of the administration that they basically only talk about the military strategy, and that's certainly what a conversation about troop numbers is all about, is a huge mistake. But I guess the way to disagree a little bit, I think if the military has been the leading sort of agency, the military is the leading agency in this war up to date, and certainly has, reining them in then has an impact, has an ancillary impact on other issues. And so that's where I think this actually is a positive, because I think what it does is it sort of prevents the military from basically playing the lead role here. It basically says it prevents them from doing things they can with the East. It's going to prevent them from doing certain things they want to do. And it's good, and by reining them in, that creates, I think, lays the groundwork for doing some more stuff on the political side. But I think you're right. I mean, I think to the point about what does it look like, I hope that Congress, instead of just voting on meaningless bills to defund the war in Libya, actually pushes them on Afghanistan and says, okay, what can we do? What are you going to do next? What is the political process going to look like? If they're upset about the troop results not being large enough, then push them on this. And that's what Congress really needs to step up and do, and they haven't done it to date. And I think probably because they don't understand the issues so well. But that's kind of where somebody has pressure, and it has to come from Congress at this point. Because, and I think you're right, until that pressure is put on them, on the administration, they're going to keep sort of kicking the can down the road. Because in the end, part of me, and I think we probably agree a little bit, worries that the administration's sort of strategy is to declare victory and go home. And they're not that overly concerned about what happens after they leave. Yeah. And that's where I think we should all be concerned about that. Because, ultimately, destabilization in Afghanistan is while probably tangential to our interests, is bad for the region. And anything bad for the region is probably going to be, in some ways, bad for us.
Well, there I think we agree. And I think this Bonn conference at the end of the year in December is the right sort of target of opportunity to be developing a serious political strategy. And I spent 21 years in the State Department, and I'm not confident of its ability to formulate that political strategy and at the same time take over a lot of responsibilities from the military as it begins to draw down, plus reconfigure its own posture of the civilian assistance people in Afghanistan. These are enormous challenges that they face, I think they have a great opportunity in the next few months to straighten this out. But am I absolutely confident that they will? Well, if the president had given us a little bit more guidance on the political side, I think I might have had more confidence that people would meet his expectations. But he's not given us a hell of a lot.
Well, I think I'll just say one thing about this. I think the idea that state would take the lead on a political settlement is, to my mind, a huge mistake. Actually,
who would take it?
It would be Grossman, I assume, and I mean.
Well, that's the Grossman in State Department.
He doesn't have the juice to possibly get a deal, and also we're not an impartial participant in this conflict. This is why, and I wrote about this in the L.A. Times last week. You need to have a third-party facilitator, and I should say I stole the idea from the Century Foundation developed this idea. You need a third-party facilitator who's not an American, who's not a Pakistani, not an Afghan, to bring all the sides together and try to feel out what a political settlement looks like. That, to me, should have happened a year and a half ago. It should happen right now. And I don't understand why the administration is resisting this. I guess they want to have control of the process.
Well, the Americans always want control of the process. There's no question in my mind about that. This question of the third-party facilitator is an interesting question, though. You really think that the UN can handle that?
I don't see what other choice you have. I don't see how the U.S. can handle it. And I don't see how the U.S. can be seen as a trusted negotiator.
No. If we're the negotiator, we're a negotiator for our own interests, not a third party.
That's exactly
right.
But
not all peace arrangements are made by third parties. Lots of them are made.
No, that is true.
Lots of them are made directly by the belligerents themselves.
But that's not. But the problem. Well, yes, of course that's true. And I think what makes this more challenging to some extent is how many actors you have at the table. I mean, you have not just the U.S. and the Taliban. You have the Afghan government. You have the Pakistanis. You've got the Russians. You've got the Indians. You've got a lot of different groups at play here. And I think because the U.S. relationship with Pakistanis, with the Afghan government, and with the Taliban is so complex, it just makes more sense to turn this over to somebody who's sort of more impartial. And maybe look, the UN. It's not a panacea, but it just seems to me a better option than trying to do a process where we're somehow negotiating directly with the Taliban.
We certainly wouldn't be a third neutral party, that's for sure. Stefano de Mistura, the UN guy, was here a few months ago, and he unquestionably talked to people about this. He talked publicly about it. And I see no sign that the president has bought on to this.
No, I haven't either. I know people in the administration have bought into it, but the president's not bought into it.
I don't see it. And it might be better. I have enormous respect for Stefano de Mistura, and he's done terrific work in other contexts. And, this is a really tough job, and he would have to have the full confidence of the President of the United States to be successful at this effort, and I see no sign that that's happening at the moment.
Well, see, but again, I don't understand this. I mean, this is what I don't get. What does the U.S. have to lose by, let's say, I mean, the person, of course, who Sentry mentioned, and I think it's a good choice, would be Lakhdar Brahimi. What would be the problem with basically giving him a mandate to feel out all sides toward political reconciliation? What would be the problem with doing that? I mean, it just seems to me an obvious strategy to test the waters for interest for political reconciliation.
Well, you lose some degree of control. That's the argument against it. I mean, Brahimi was asked not to bring the Taliban into the tent at the time of the Bonn conference 10 years ago.
Which was a mistake.
And it was a big mistake, but, the Americans wanted control, and they got control, at least of the conference, not of Afghanistan. But I don't disagree with that in principle. It's really a question of how you gain the confidence of the president, because it really requires that whoever has the mandate has a real mandate from the Americans to explore things.
Right. But I think, to your point about losing control, I mean, we don't have a lot of control now. I mean, I don't see...
Well, we control our own negotiating position. Let's put it that way. I mean,
we do, but we don't have it. I don't even know if we have a negotiating
I mean, we control Grossman. I mean,
No, but it's not a tenable situation. I hear what you're saying, but I don't see. It's got to be better than the current situation where you're basically sitting here talking to Taliban in Germany, and you're keeping the Afghan government out of the process. The Pakistanis aren't involved.
Yeah, well, I don't think I disagree with that in principle. I don't actually know exactly what the situation is and who's involved and.
Right.
It'd be surprising to me if the Germans didn't have the Afghan involvement in some form.
I disagree, because I feel like, why would Karzai have come out and leaked the talks if not for the fact that he's PO'd about the fact that he's not included? I mean,
I don't know. I just am not privy. I know Michael Steiner, the German who does this stuff quite well, but I just am not privy to what is actually going on. So I don't feel free to criticize it. Let's put it that way.
Okay. I don't mean I didn't criticize. It's more a question of saying it doesn't appear, as an outsider looking, very far afield, as though much is coming of this, or much will come of this if you don't.
No, but I think we're agreed. There's no political strategy at the moment that really has the imprimatur of the president, and that's really what
I think that's right
at this point. Listen, it's been very good talking with you.
That's very good, and we can end on an area of agreement. I think we actually do agree on that last point. So hopefully going forward, it'll be a little bit better on the political side.
It's been a pleasure.
As always, yeah, very pleasure. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Ciao.
Thanks a lot. Okay, bye-bye.